Let's first kick off talking about what's going on statewide. I know that you had done a poll relatively recently, about 2 weeks ago.
Yes.
Why don't you just tell us about that and go ahead, please.
So what had happened was that I had polled the treasurer's race as qualifying was going on. And in that poll, I had put in the major candidates. The one thing that was a little different than what ultimately happened when qualifying ended was that I had tested two different Democrats, one of whom, Derek Edwards, did ultimately run, the other of whom, Walt Leger, the Speaker Pro Tem, did not. But the idea was I wanted to get an idea about how those Democrats polled, as did the major Republicans. Really, several takeaways. First off, very large undecided percentage, which is not really surprising when you consider that this is a down ballot race. The advertising has not really started yet.
Right.
And, it's kind of funny. A lot of times people running for office think that just because they start showing up at these various meet and greets, that all of a sudden that means that their name recognition is going to appropriately spike. And well, it doesn't really work that way. You have to go on some kind of a mass media if you want to see your numbers move at a statewide level, as opposed to, say, running for state rep. So large undecided percentage was about 60%. That was the first takeaway. The other takeaway is, and this is the one I found even more interesting than the Republican candidates, that was regardless of whether I used Derek Edwards or Speaker Pro Tem Walt Leger as the Democrat, both of them polled about the same in the aggregate, which suggests to me that if the Democrats stay united, there is a certain percentage of the vote available for Democratic candidate. The third takeaway is that none of the three Republicans, despite emails that one of the candidates sent out already quoting me, none of the Republican candidates has an inherent advantage. All of them are within a point or two of each other. And so really what it boils down to is, in this kind of election where, quite honestly, it's going to be a chronic voter kind of election, I'm thinking in the 20 to 25% turnout level, that it really comes down to the strategic decisions that each of the major candidates make, the type of the ads they run, and so forth. It's really kind of those intangibles that will swing the race one way or another for the Republican candidates. But I am of the opinion, unless you see a big fragmenting of the Democratic vote, I would expect Derek Edwards to be occupying one of the runoff slots, because you have multiple Republicans going after the same vote. The Democratic vote has pretty much got Derek Edwards and perhaps Ron Caesar, and that's about it in terms of who the Democrats could vote for.
Okay. Now, Derek Edwards, if I'm not mistaken, he's an attorney.
Yes.
And he's relatively unknown. I mean, he ran for U.S. Senate.
Yes.
You were, this was, the poll itself was paid for by?
I want to get the name right. It's Accountable Louisiana PAC. It was a super PAC that paid for it.
Okay. Now, I did some research. I couldn't find them. Are they well known, or?
It's a consortium. I just know one of the people in there, and it's a consortium of several people, is my understanding. And Jeremy Alford actually did some digging into there.
Okay.
And he went to the incorporation documents, and
yeah.
I think it was like a Robert or Mike Johnson from New Orleans was the incorporator or something like that.
Right.
So anyway, that's who it is. They the super PAC had paid for me to do this poll.
Okay. And of course, you had declared that. And yeah. So, are you aware of any other polls on that race?
None whatsoever. And that's what's kind of interesting is, I'm sure there's probably some internal polling that either the Schroder or Reiser or Davis people are doing right now. But in terms of anything that would be publicly released, I've not seen anything. And I suspect, truthfully, that probably the Vern Kennedys and Bernie Pincenats of the world, if they were to release anything, I would not expect anything till maybe September or October, given that I don't expect this race to start heating up for another 3 to 4 weeks.
Sure. But there's a number of different elections going on statewide.
Yes.
Particularly here in New Orleans area.
Yes.
Mayor, city council, and other races. So I imagine that with those elections, particularly in New Orleans, that's going to be real important, I think, in terms maybe that could make a difference in terms of one of the Democrats actually getting, say, more votes out.
Yeah. And what's interesting about that, because I've had that very same statement that you just made repeated to me quite a few times. Okay. It's almost taken on kind of a conventional wisdom status. It's certainly not a statement, that being the influence of Orleans Parish on this one election. It's certainly not something I would disagree with entirely. However, when you're talking about the influence New Orleans makes, there are two pieces to the puzzle here. Number one would be the turnout across the state in the other 63 parishes, where you have a fair number of elections that are going on as well, such as 2 state rep seats. There's several judicial races. You have a PSC race. There's a council race in Jefferson Parish. So you do have other things on the ballot besides just all the municipal elections. So that's one half of the equation. The other half of the equation, which is equally interesting, is what would be the assumed level of turnout in Orleans Parish. I did a little research about that, and what I found interesting was when I looked at the 2010 and 14 municipal elections in Orleans Parish, turnout was in the 30s. In other words, you did not have super high turnout in Orleans Parish in those years. And ironically, turnout in 2014, when Mitch Landrieu was running for re-election, was actually higher, a little bit higher than it was in 2010 when it was truly an open seat race. So where I'm going with this is, if it were a situation where you say Orleans Parish turnout were like in the 40s or 50s and the rest of the state was in the upper teens, then yes, I would expect Orleans Parish would have a pretty large influence on the statewide outcome, probably 15 to 20% of the statewide vote from that one parish. But given that I did not see super high turnout in Orleans Parish in the last 2 election cycles, I'm not entirely convinced that I would see that 40 to 50% turnout. If it is in the 30s like it has been in the past, I calculated that Orleans Parish would represent more in the 12 to 14% range statewide, which is still good, but it's not what some people are thinking it would be, given that Orleans Parish are kind of the marquee race